Good morning. My name is Margaretta Lovell. I'm chair of the Senate Library Committee, and I'm a member of the Commission as well. It's my great pleasure to introduce and to moderate this session, our second session this morning, and to first introduce Kevin Starr and then our respondent, Tom Leonard. Kevin Starr, who you know, is the former state librarian. He is an academic star, and I think everyone's favorite public intellectual. He will be speaking about the research library as repository of knowledge and memory, and his respondent, university librarian and professor of journalism, Tom Leonard, will then pick up the ball. Kevin Starr is, as you know, an historian. You may not know that his degrees are in English. That's an interesting transition. He's spent most of his life in California, but he did take a detour to Harvard to pick up an MA and a PhD. He is a recipient of the National Humanities Medal, and I think in academic terms he's a Renaissance man who has taught in departments of English and history and political science and urban and regional planning, and perhaps most appropriately for our talk today, a department of just plain humanities. I'll bet he's read Moby Dick. A native Californian, he's written with Churchillian breadth in a series of 7 unusually readable volumes about the cultural and social history of the Golden State, beginning with Americans and the California Dream 1850 to 1915 in 1973, and most recently with California, a History and California Dreams, California in an Age of Abundance, 1950 to 1963, in 2005 and 2009, respectively. He has a degree in library science from this institution, and and as you might guess, he has a special relationship with the Bancroft Library.
Thank you. I'm delightful to be back here. I took my library science degree a long time ago, here in 1974, and it was a wonderful program, just marvelous, and I'm just thrilled to be back and to be connected with the library community of this great university. And unfortunately, I'm no longer state librarian. I was there for 10 years, and the University of Southern California wanted me back, and so I went back there because I can't then do what I usually do. Usually, when I was state librarian, I'd give you all exemptions from any overdue book fines you had at the local public library. A lot of people say, well, we don't know we had a state library. Yes, we do have a state library. It was the first comprehensive library in the history of this state, and until the rise of the library here at Berkeley, it was the only major comprehensive library. And today it handles all sorts of financial aspects of building libraries, etc. We had a $500 million library construction fund a number of years ago. It has a research bureau, some 23 researchers who do public policy background research for the state, and it takes care of the need of our 500,000 blind or near blind in California. So it's a wonderful job, and I enjoyed it enormously. In fact, in the 19th century, the job was usually given to political hacks. And I did, during my 10 years, did my best to restore that tradition, in that I love the political aspects of it. But getting budgets, dealing with our elected officials on both sides of the aisle, going through the process of making the case for libraries and state government. And I flatter myself that I was reasonably successful at that. And as a book collector, I was privileged to obtain, a number of years ago, James Westfall Thompson's personal copy of his classic study, The Medieval Library, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1939. My first impression of the book was of Thompson's numerous annotations in his minuscule but clear handwriting, ink on paper. In certain cases, Thompson would annotate a sentence or clarify a word. In other cases, he would correct an error down to a missing period or comma if necessary. These annotations, sometimes expressing absolute anguish of soul over a missing semicolon. These annotations were never discursive. After all, he had written the book. But they do show a distinguished librarian and scholar of library history continuing to wrestle through reading and annotation, to wrestle with his topic, to wrestle with the big picture, and what another great bibliographer, Dr. Samuel Johnson, calls the devil in the details. As Thompson's elegantly presented 661-page treatise, beautifully bound in blue, the favorite color of the Middle Ages, documents that the patristic, early medieval, and late medieval eras were transformative and enduring times for library formation. According to Thompson, for example, each phase of library development, early church, early monastic, that of Bobbio especially, Carolingian Renaissance, medieval Italy, the High Middle Ages edging into the Renaissance, each of these eras established collections and procedures that fed into a composite paradigm en route to the modern university research library. Forget all that stuff about books being chained to their shelves in the university libraries of the 13th century, Thompson encourages us. Of course they were. Given the scarcity of books, given the increasing importance of explication of text as a teaching technique, and given the vast number of students at places such as the University of Paris, certain texts, the sentences of Peter Lombard, for example, certain texts were the important textbooks of the era, and they would have flown off the shelves with the rapidity of angelic flight in a medieval mystery play. What was really going on in this era, if I read Thompson correctly, was a recovery and expansion of a task already begun by the Jewish and Byzantine libraries of the late classical and patristic era. The recovery of the classical research library paradigm, as remembered and reassembled, say, by Cassian and Cassiodorus, as the classical world edged into the patristic period in the West. In other words, virtually contained in the medieval library, to use a term virtually contained, beloved by the medieval scholastic philosophers, virtually contained within the medieval library in the West were the Byzantine and Jewish libraries of a previous era. Today, with our expanded sense of this transformative period, thanks to the pioneering scholarship of UC Berkeley Professor Maria Mavrudi, we would cite the libraries of Islamic North Africa, Spain, and the Middle East. Now the Professor Mavrudi and her colleagues are documenting how extensive and continuous was the flow of manuscripts and collections in this area throughout the classical, Middle Eastern, Byzantine, and Western world. So then we have our first paradigm. How in library development, paradigms recovered paradigms, adjusted, reformed, and expanded them, then passed them on to the next. Could you open that the shade there, please? The light here is really not up to the university. It says Fiat Lux, it says modern. Thank you so much. We have our first paradigm, how in library development, paradigms recovered paradigms, adjusted, reformed, and expanded them, then passed them on to the next era for further development. As, say, in the case of the early modern development of scientific bibliography and library management, as exemplified in the career and writings of Gabriel Naudet, 1600-1653, the first modern professional librarian. His clients included Cardinal Richelieu, Queen Christina of Sweden, and Cardinal Mazarin, book collectors and library builders all, and author of Advice on Establishing a Library, which he wrote at the start of his career. Let's move on to a second paradigm at work in the era of library development described by James Westfall Thompson, the late classical, patristic, and medieval effort present in various ways and contests in the differing traditions of Judaism, Hellenic Christianity, Latin Christianity, and Islam, somehow to align, synthesize, or merely reconcile faith and reason, or merely to align them in a friendly manner. Each of these cultures were based on profoundly historical traditions with theological origins. Yet each of these cultures, taken at their best, respected reason, inquiry, engagement with the world. Islam, for example, rediscovered Aristotle prior to the Latin West, and science, while virtually absent in the modern sense of that term, the term science was virtually contained, again to use the scholastic term, in the empirical, observational, inductive, deductive epistemology of Aristotle. In contrast to science, engineering maintained its continuity with the classical world. Indeed, in the case of the medieval cathedral, engineering built upon it in a most dramatic manner. The effort to be rational and analytical, applied and practical, even in matters of faith, gave rise not only to Moses Maimonides, Avicenna, Averroes, or Thomas Aquinas, but to the growing richness of library collections in a diversity of fields engaged with the plenum mundi, the fullness of the world, including a recovery, reading, and reapplication of classical manuscripts. The library, in short, preserved the phenomenology and fullness of human and natural experience. So then we now have a second paradigm to add to the paradigm of paradigms, recovering paradigms. The effort to be rational, analytic, engaged, while at the same time inheriting paradigms and traditions. And I kid you not, we university librarians, we librarians of every sort, in fact, but we university librarians especially face such challenges, such as a clash of paradigms, in fact, at a near overwhelming but totally challenging and exhilarating level of intensity. From the early modern university and the Enlightenment, we inherit the model of the research library at the center of the university. Indeed, almost the equivalent of the chapel in the early medieval monastic schools en route to the medieval colleges of Oxford and Cambridge. There is no great university today that does not have a great research library at its core, at its center. There is no university today that desires to be indisputably great, to realize its best possibilities, that does not, in one way or another, plan to develop and upgrade its library system and its central research library as part of its process of improvement. In what the California historian Herbert Howe Bancroft described as a rapid, monstrous maturity, in the case of the fast forwarding of Gold Rush, California, the American Research Library, the American Research University, emerged between 1880 and 1920, building upon collegiate models inherited from the Middle Ages, imported German models via Johns Hopkins, and created research universities served by laboratories for experimental science and laboratories and libraries capable of sustaining advanced growth. It is amazing how quickly this happened. One of my heroes in American library history, Justin Windsor, author and editor of the Narrative and Critical History of the United States in 8 volumes, librarian of Boston Public, longtime librarian of Harvard College, helped perform this task of research, collection, development, and modern library organization for Harvard in the late 19th century. In my personal library of library-related scholarship, I have a copy of my late friend William Bentinck Smith's Building a Great Library, the Coolidge Years of Harvard, 1976, chronicling how Archibald Cary Coolidge, professor of history and director of the University Library, continued this work on an even more heroic level on behalf of the newly constructed Widener Library. My good friend Andrew Jameson, formerly Assistant Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Affairs on this campus, having completed his second doctorate at Harvard after taking a doctorate at the Sorbonne in African history, in the aftermath of World War II, was sent by McGeorge Bundy, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, on an 18-month travel and buying tour of sub-Saharan Africa in an effort to prepare for what Bundy felt would be the rising importance of this region in the post-colonial era. Another good friend of mine, the late Lawrence Clark Powell, was similarly commissioned by UCLA Chancellor Franklin Murphy to transform as rapidly as possible the serviceable 400,000 volume UCLA library into a general research library capable of keeping pace, indeed capable of enabling the rise of UCLA to its premier status as a world-class research university. Here in Berkeley, in the epicenter of the 1880-1920 era, University President Benjamin I. Wheeler, whose hall we are in, who knew what a first-rate university library was from his days as a graduate student at Berlin, launched the University of California in the same direction, resulting in many of the fine libraries here, but specifically the Doe Library. I was just informed earlier today that Bret Hart was offered the first university librarianship here. But he turned it down, yes. So then, like our predecessors, we inherit a paradigm, a model, the research library at the center of a great university. Like our predecessors, we inherit this paradigm in an age of digital revolution and a dawning age of limits of tax support in those great universities that are public, but also a dawning era of limited philanthropic support for libraries in the era of increasing taxation, especially constricting of middle class and upper middle class support. Some universities have canceled their Friends programs as costing more than they produce in donations. Contrast this, if you will, incidentally, with the increasing level of outreach to mid-level donors by the UC library system. At this time of self-examination, it behooves us to examine the third paradigm I evoked from the reading of Thompson's The Medieval Library, or indeed from my studies of the Puritan theology of New England while I was in graduate school at Harvard. Do we university librarians still possess the faith once given to the saints, as the Puritans might have put it, which is to say a continuing conviction based in reason and analysis, as well as a respect for tradition, which is to say tradition perceived as continuing but a developing paradigm. In the continuing relevance, however, it is to be that has to be reconfigured and refinanced if the university library is to move into what it is now successfully, what is now becoming or has become a global local entity, flourishing at the center of the modern research university and serving in a very special way those disciplines and interdisciplines requiring primary documentation. The question of belief, not blind belief, mind you, but belief that results from what the medievals called fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking reasoning, which is to say the belief and hopes that a major paradigm can be transformed to the point of transmogrification without disappearing entirely. In this regard, I remember my decade as state librarian when so many local elected officials, anxious to wrestle into submission a rebellious budget, asked why the body politic should support public libraries when books in libraries are almost a thing of the past. Tell that, if you will, of course, to Chicago and Seattle and the other great American cities that have recently built wonderful public libraries. Tell that to the voters of California, who nearly 20 years ago, at the very time that the bookless library was being used as an argument for non-funding, passed a bond issue for the California State Library to build a $500 million worth of public libraries in California, the single largest library construction fund in the history of this nation, administered by the state librarian and his SWAT team of commando librarians. Tell that to the Department of Finance, Governor Gray Davis, and State Senator Pro Tem John Burton, who in better times than this, of course, made a governor's stimulus fund grant of $89 million to the J. Paul Leonard and Sutro libraries of San Francisco State University. But if such an enduring faith in the faith once given to the saints is characteristic of public libraries, witness the wonderful new branch public library just opened in the Bayview Hunters Point district of San Francisco, is it equally true of the academic research library community? My answer is that it has to be. For without faith in the past, present, and future survival, in the past, present, and future usefulness and continuity of the University Research Library. Despite the intergalactic challenges we are experiencing, we may very well lose a forthcoming round of short-term battles that will in the long run lead to more long-term losses. Such a commitment to the cause is a commonplace of politics. Those who truly believe tend to prevail, provided that they are capable of taking good advice. From this perspective, we in the university library world are prevailing, are seeking good advice regarding short-term and long-term solutions. We heard so many wonderful suggestions this morning, mostly midterm, not too many short-term, but midterm and long-term solutions. Wonderful presentations. Locally in California, we have some failed paradigms to guide us. No UC campus has embraced the bookless library concept, for example, but it was embraced by at least 2 CSU campuses and readily repudiated due to student and faculty opposition. Across the spectrum, we university librarians are struggling within, behind, and in front of the developing paradigm. In an age of digitization, we have long since begun to digitize primary sources, thereby affecting what John Naisbitt might very well describe as a high-tech, high-touch solution. The high-tech of digitization, the high-touch of primary resources, as in the case of the $2 million grant, if I remember the number correctly, made by the California State Library to the UC Library, the UC Bancroft Library, to digitize more than 100,000 primary documents and 10,000 visual images pertaining to the great earthquake and fire of April 1906. We have therefore responded to the challenges of keeping primary materials somewhere safe and retrievable while globalizing their extension and use. As we contemplate the challenges presented to us by continuing financial scarcity since 2008 or even earlier, our thoughts begin to turn increasingly to cooperative ventures as a way of economizing output without cutting back on standards of service. Already the horrendous costs of digital subscriptions, as cited this morning, to professional and scientific journals, as well as services such as JSTOR in the humanities and social sciences. These costs have allowed us, given the the costs and the digitization, have given us the relatively easy storage and distribution of digital resources to launch cooperative and joint subscriptions and distributions of digital materials. The same must become increasingly the case with print materials, especially those that, while not technically in the rare books category, represent the scarce and hard to find monographs essential to a supportive research collection. We heard so wonderfully about that this morning. Forgive me if I once more draw upon my personal experience as state librarian. A very expensive monograph was published a number of years ago on the subject, Deaconesses in the Early Christian Church. Now, if I remember correctly, the book was Cambridge University Press, if I remember correctly, retailed for something like $175, which seemed impressive at the time, but which is now a commonplace price for advanced scholarly material. For my own library, for example, I'm sometimes horrified to see what books university press books are costing these days. But at the state library, and this is pre the digital age, we had the ability, thanks to the Library of California, to encourage the CSU system, taking this book as a case study in point, to buy at least 3 copies for our 40 million Californians, especially the importance of the topics, perhaps in the history of women, the history of feminism, ecclesiastical history, history of the classical period and the patristic period. And through the CSU system, we brought these copies, and the state library, under the Library of California, guaranteed that those books would be delivered anywhere. And it was wonderful at one point to track this, to find a young high school student, I think it was in Ukiah, California, getting a copy from Long Beach and writing her high school paper on women in this early phase of Christianity. The model is clear. It's even more intensified now, of course, with all the technology we heard from this morning. Selective purchasing and collective sharing has now become an extraordinarily developing field, and I won't even dare. I'm just dropping a paragraph or two because it seems so naive compared to the marvelous things we heard this morning. Now, obviously, the university is going to be thinking in this direction. The total university, I'm thinking. Berkeley and Los Angeles with its two great libraries, but the other fields as well. One can envision very easily, if the agreement is there, that certain kinds of expertise, certain kinds of subjects like environmentalism and astronomy at UC Santa Cruz, for instance, could be collected there. A regional campus could be assigned primary responsibility for a subject. Now, obviously, the collections of UC Davis relating to agriculture, agronomy, viticulture, and a host of other related subjects should remain UC Davis-centered as far as collection efforts are concerned. But how would such cost savings, some of which are already underway, relate to the desire of a great university to have its research library be as comprehensive as possible? This brings up the question of what metrics, beyond the ARL investment index, should be used to gauge the health of a top-tier university library. Perhaps one of those metrics could be the library's participation in joint acquisition and shared collections, in terms of being a collector, a lender, and a borrower from other libraries. A top-tier university library, in other words, should be comprehensive, but it could, in certain cases, get to its comprehensiveness in part as the result of cooperation without loss of status. Already the interlibrary program in force in our university libraries seems almost primitive compared to the techniques and technologies we heard this morning, but it's a step in the right direction over the past 3 decades. I fully realize that the University of California has been doing such intercampus sharing for decades, but I do believe I have the hope that that paradigm connected to physical books becomes a paradigm for digital sharing as well. Or at least I believe that when the State Library a number of years ago made a major grant to the University of California and San Francisco Medical Library, a couple $1 million for the purchase of some of those scholarly technical and medical books, periodicals that we heard about this morning. While professional libraries, say law, medicine, engineering, business, might be able to come to terms with such a UC-wide paradigm, it would be more difficult for such great and historic libraries as the general research collections of Berkeley and UCLA to enter into even more complete cooperation with its sister campuses. Given the fact that so much of the identity and prestige of a campus will still emanate so powerfully from the reputation of its general research collection. This brings us to the question of collecting print materials in general in an age of increasing digitization. Because of Google Books, for instance, I was able to consult a very scarce recently history of St. Augustine, Florida, with a detailed account of the Florida-Carolina War of 1702. I'm sure that there are very few copies of that book available in the American West, and there, of course, with the Google project at Stanford, there it was. Such pleasures are commonplace with most of you, but the prospect of more and more books coming online is, to me, exhilarating. Oh, brave new world that has such beauteous and plentiful digital books in it. I might very well explain in paraphrase of Shakespeare's Miranda. But remember, we used to talk very readily about establishing a moon colony, even a colony on Mars. It took only a crowded decade, after all, since President Kennedy's announcement to develop the technology that got us on the moon. There was a strong possibility, that is, that a retroactive digitizing on the heroic and comprehensive scale that was initially promised and talked about just a few short years ago won't be happening for some time. Which means that collection development, however jointly operated, will have to continue to seek out printed materials. And that in and of itself means that cooperation, joint operation, designated subject areas, and digital transmission of mutually owned materials, in other words, an integrated information and storage sharing system will be increasingly part of the profile of a research library for great universities. The future suggests shared resources, that's for sure. But does the future suggest an even more dramatic division between general collections, special collections, and research collections on the top-tier university campuses. As a graduate student at Harvard more than a half-century ago, I loved to do research in Widener. When it came to read for courses and prepare for orals, I loved the undergraduate Lamont Library, dating to 1950, and one of the first purely undergraduate libraries on a major American campus. When seated in the basement of Lamont Library in a comfortable leather chair, the Cambridge history collections in view, I read for breadth and wisdom, and all around me I felt a kind of expansive magic emanating from the library. On a rainy day in 1974, when I was pursuing my master's in library science here from UC Berkeley, I experienced that same magic once again in the Morrison Library, seated in an equally comfortable leather chair, perusing a copy of Frederick Rolfe's Hadrian VI. I later saw the play in London when I should have been busy about my library science. Enter Widener, by contrast, at a later time, entered the Bancroft Library, where I seem to have been sat for 2 decades, or the Huntington Library, where I was privileged to spend a year as a research fellow, and I was experiencing something other than a genial reader's comfort in a good book on a rainy day, or an undergraduate's desire to expand and internalize what Henry James calls felt life through youthful reading. I felt research, which by definition is a professional as well as a generally humanistic activity. Is not, after all, the research library the equivalent for the humanist and the social scientists of the laboratory for the scientist and the engineer? Which is a roundabout way of saying that there is value in allocating library space for research purposes only. That is, as space accessible only to faculty, graduate students, and other researchers. I think it was a wonderful idea, for instance, 20 years ago, to introduce hundreds of UC library undergraduates in the Bancroft, to the use of the Bancroft Library. But if you could have waited with myself and my colleagues outside as we waited for admission, there would have been another opinion given at that time. And yet the undergraduate library experiment was launched by Lamont some 63 years ago. It was based on the premise that there is a kind of usage appropriate to a certain kind of clientele. Why should not a great research library, which makes available research laboratories to its research scientists, a research university makes research laboratories to its research scientists, do the same, make comparable arrangements for its productive scholars in humanities and social sciences and related fields. And incidentally, in the case of a developing library, such as the Doheny Memorial Library at USC, why is it not totally appropriate, since the goal of comprehensive grandeur has long since become an impossibility, not only to provide space, but to provide collection development backing the research interests and special needs of active research-producing faculty. You can't have Falstaff and have him lean. Research is, while I will not use the elite word, research is a highly focused activity that is totally compatible to democratic purposes in a publicly franchised institution. Now, notice that I said publicly franchised. I would love to say publicly supported, but UC Berkeley has established a model in recent years of a globally important university that was publicly initiated and publicly developed and publicly supported in its early years, making the transition to a hybrid public-private enterprise with private support becoming increasingly critical, in fact, becoming dominant. As state librarian, I was very proud of our Audubon double elephant folio. But that came to us in 1863 in lieu of taxes. And I remember correctly, I used to show it to the legislators. They would ask me, how much would this get in the London market? I think at the time it was $9 million, and I said to them, don't even think about it. Don't even think about it. And while I would purchase as state librarian the Arian Press Bible, knowing that no legislator would bawl me out for buying a Bible, however expensive, I turned to the California State Library Foundation when I spent $120,000 for a Count Scott Chaucer to complete our William Morris collection, and to make sure that at least one copy of this bibliographical treasure was in the hands of the general public of California citizens. Under the intergalactic distinction as director of the Bancroft, Professor Charles Faulhaber, of course, has recently shown the possibilities of private sector fundraising connected to great research libraries. In responding finally to the question, is the vision of a top-tier university library as a repository of knowledge for future generations well-defined, meaningful, and attainable? The answer is, and I think that it's an answer that goes back to my earlier discussion of James Westfall Thompson's The Medieval Library. The answer is that it is attainable if we believe in it. Not blindly believe in it, but believe in it after making a critical examination of historical development of research libraries, as well as making a leap of faith, the one interactive with the other. Do we in the library, certainly the leap of faith is necessary. None of us want to feel that we're devoting our lives to an institution that's at a dead end. It's an institution, in fact, that has a magnificent, and I have to use that wonderful word used this morning, transformative future ahead of it. We have to have both that faith and that critical analysis and the ability to work with challenges. Do we in the library community truly believe that our institution, however transformed, however adapted, however beleaguered and challenged, will prevail? Do we believe that librarianship, in the comprehensive sense of that term, to include bibliography, that the library as an institution, not just in its bibliographical sense, but in its total relationship to knowledge, the library is in and of itself, a research library constitutes an essential mode of knowledge. Not just a collection of information, that is, but as a mode, a way of defining the composites of knowledge and holding those composites, those components together. Do we take any comfort from Lewis Mumford's observation that the very rise of the city in ancient times constituted the spatialization and engineering of an archive, a library of human needs and functions, and the resources that served human survival? In the battle of the budget, in the search for efficiency and economy, in the very act of defining to ourselves what a great university is, do we communicate to our constituents and those in authority over our institutions, do we communicate our enduring commitment to the library, however challenged, however changed by future technology and need? The library is an essential, indeed, almost anthropologically necessary institution. Hooray for digitization, unless the human need for physical space disappears entirely, unless we become, that is, noetic jellyfish swimming in a vast cyber sea, our essential functions of governance, education, land use, water storage, memory, culture, worship, these essential functions will in one way or another continue to be connected to and to a certain extent dependent upon shared and institutionalized space. You begin with us. We in the library community might very well say to our colleagues within the university and beyond, the whole university community began with us in the Library of Alexandria, and the university continued to develop down through the centuries in the cultures of East and West and those in between through the research library. Even when our resources were meager and fragile, as in the Middle Ages, we were attached to the developing university. In the Enlightenment, we formed the center, along with the laboratory and the curiosity cabinet and the museum. We formed the center for an expanded university mandate. We brought collegiate education to North America, to Mexico City, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Quebec. And we paced and expressed the creation of a modern American research university. We librarians continue in our university life to function and serve at those critical intersection points in which information emerges into knowledge through organization, analysis, and research to the enlightenment and practical benefit of the societies we serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very inspiring. We will now have our respondent, Tom Leonard. He holds a doctorate in history from UC Berkeley and joined the School of Journalism here in 1973, where he taught and wrote about the role of the press in society. He served as university librarian since 2001. This is a complicated job. It has been made more complicated by serious defunding of the central resource in recent years. Defunding that has resulted in cuts to the collections budget, serious cuts to the collections budget, and a loss of 25% of our library staff. In the rankings published by the American Research Libraries, Berkeley has fallen from 4th in the nation to 12th over the past 5 years, situating us now behind Penn State and University of Alberta. How he's managed to preserve his legendary good humor is a mystery to me.
Thank you, Margaretta. And the one thing I've learned in this job is that you never want to follow Kevin Starr. First mistake. However, this is not a fixed fight. I didn't know exactly what Kevin was going to say, but since I've had the pleasure of hearing him before, I did have some good ideas. And let me just say that the reason California has more libraries than it has McDonald's is due to, I can think of no other person, as a public intellectual and as an administrator, no other person deserves that credit than Kevin. Thank you very much. So I had an idea of what he might say, and I thought of what I might add to the comprehensive and solid picture he's given us of how libraries change and how they need to change in the future. Indeed, in Pam's words, how we can meet our obligation to invent the future. One way of looking at this, and I'm reminded of it by looking at the age of the buildings across the way, and is to think about the great research libraries that Kevin drew our attention to, all built in a slice of years in the early 20th century, all built by men and women who were born in the 19th. And we are in a parallel situation, aren't we? We want to invent a library system, all of us born in the 20th century. We might learn some lessons from how they went about it. And I actually would draw a larger picture of discontinuity than continuity in that effort. I think that the modern, early 20th century research library was as much a break from the past as it was truly a continuation of some core values that had been in library culture since medieval and classical times. But that's a nuance. If you look at the years, you begin to see a picture. California, here in Berkeley and Chicago, opened their great modern libraries in 1912. The Widener at Harvard opened in 1915. Michigan opened its current central library in 1920. And Columbia Library was twice born, once in 1897 and the other time in 1934. This is an arbitrary and playful selection of libraries. I chose the places that our new chancellor, Nick Dirks, has spent most of his time. The people who built these libraries knew that there was a new world out there. As Kevin mentioned, they were prompted especially by European example and especially the research that was coming to form higher education in Germany. They knew they were doing something new and they knew they wanted to do it right. Libraries for students, and I would say for faculty in the late 19th century, were sleepy places compared to what happened in these new libraries. Library hours at all these places in the late 19th century resemble what we now call banker's hours. These buildings were often empty of students, except those reading textbooks or the materials for the fixed curriculum. And looking across at Doe, I'm reminded that the first opportunity Cal students had to read a book in a library at night was when that library opened. We'd gotten on quite nicely, thank you, without providing that service before. The university leadership that created these new spaces, and that we still live with and try to adapt today, were an unusual group of administrators, and the first thing that would strike you about them, of the schools I mentioned, is their age. When Widener and Doe opened, the president and chancellor of these institutions were not yet 60 years old. At Chicago, the intellectual force behind the library, William Rainey Harper, was 49 when he died, and the Harper Memorial Library opened before he would have been 55. At Michigan in 1920, the president who presided over the new library was not yet 50, and the formidable Nicholas Murray Butler at Columbia took charge of a central library that was 4 years old in 1897. President Butler was himself 38. Now this is not, Lord knows, a depreciation of the contribution of administrators with white hair. It is to suggest that the modern library as we used to know it was in higher education. The creation of people who were at an earlier arc of their career than the leaders of much of higher education today. And the lesson I learned from this and try to see followed is that all of us in thinking about libraries have to try harder to get the perspective of the graduate students, the postdocs, and the assistant professors. The people on the commission know all of the forces that make it difficult to hear those voices and have them participate. But it's really important because if we were to draw an inference from these institutions I've just mentioned, we would see there was some value in being a little bit earlier in your career than sometimes is true today for top administrators. I have only one other look at higher education in the library to share with you, and it comes from a person and a book that I think many of you are familiar with. A few years ago, Jonathan Cole, the long-term provost at Columbia, wrote The Great American University. He presented some of these ideas as a guest on the Berkeley campus. And I think it's one of the most respected works on the development of the modern research university, written by someone who is an insider. He writes towards the end of this volume, the librarians and academic information staff members of universities are critically important to the quality of these institutions. They are, in many ways, the custodians of culture. That is the problem, isn't it? Think of the word custodian. It's a job description that has only modest status on our campus. Though if we were honest, there are custodians across campus that are much better liked than the people who have offices in the building. And I'm making a serious point here. In our teaching and research, we are all about challenging tradition and making discoveries. We would value the consolidation of knowledge and its organization and preservation more if we aspired truly to be custodians of culture. Those of you with NSF grants can look into your hearts and tell me the satisfaction you felt in having to meet the new requirements for a data management plan. If it was an annoyance, then being a custodian of culture was not high on your list of things that you want to accomplish. Not to worry. Librarians, library professionals want to lead you here and they want to be helpful here. And they've already begun doing this, as I think you're aware, with the NSF requirement. Library professionals not only want to lead in keeping knowledge safe for a very long time, they want to lead in helping the campus make choices about what knowledge should be and what should be collected, how to provide access through licensing, purchasing, or borrowing, how to organize what we have so you can find it, how to navigate the collections of both published work and data when you are a newcomer to the field, as all students must be, or when you cross disciplinary boundaries, which our faculty are increasingly doing. The re-envisioning self-study in the library has a simple message about Professor Cole's apt phrase, custodians of culture. Now that we no longer have to organize libraries the way we did in the past around shelving decisions, let's work on our higher level services, free of the custodian model that we have had, which involved the honorable work of keeping doors open and offering redundant services. Your librarians, I think, want to be local heroes, but they will only deserve this title if they are local in just the right ways. Available, on call, professionally up on what the modern student researcher needs, and able to fashion some of the tools that Peter and others have reminded us are so important. Our former chancellor, Bob Berdahl, told me that he had learned at the other universities he led that librarians had the longest time frame of anyone on campus. They thought ahead decades, and I get those memos. So librarians have the longest time frame. Then he paused and said, I guess that's a good thing. It is. This symposium and my colleagues deserve all of our thanks for taking this long view and showing that we must be viewed from other perspectives, such as the one in this room, to really understand ourselves.
Good. Well, we have time for some discussion. I suppose I should first ask Tom, Kevin, would you like to respond to each other?
Well, I just wish I could have said it half as well as our distinguished university librarian has said it. And in fact, we didn't collaborate because we both we converged in a sort of Teilhard de Chardinian convergence. Exactly. James Westfall Thompson meets Berkeley in the 21st century.
They're happy. How about you guys? Carla?
I wondered if both of you could comment a little bit about the unique opportunity of the California Digital Library for Berkeley's library. I mean, it's one of our local, I would say, regional resources that maybe sets it apart or doesn't from the other national libraries that take all the vote.
The question, unless you...
I'll rephrase it. Carla's question was to say something to clarify the role of the California Digital Library, and maybe by extension, the Office of the President. Let me say, first of all, it's a sport, a blood sport, to talk about the Office of the President. In the earlier presentation about the copyright wars, I believe that both on campus and in the Office of the President, we have had very strong support. And because of the California Digital Library, we have had a coordination of legal opinion. But I think it's made it easier for us, Paul can comment about this, than it was as part of the CIC group. We had sort of one central legal authority who we could educate and get to see things from our point of view. Now, California Digital Library is a great coordinating structure for our digital initiatives, both tools and content. And I think it's one part of the Office of the President that works really well. The director, Lynn Farley, is here. She might raise her hand. So if you see it a different way, she'd like to hear from
you. Well, I would only say that the California State Library and I personally take great pride in making one of the earlier grants. I forget what it was. I think it's something like $2 or $3 million when it was started. And I was popular, very popular at UCSF, where we did it for about 15 minutes. It was a lot of fun.
Yes.
You both talked about, in your speech you talked about talking to younger students, like graduate students, postdocs. And I was curious about what you see the role of a research library as part of an educational institution, specifically for undergraduates. And so what is the role of a research library for an undergraduate education?
I don't think you can cut it off from undergraduates today. Undergraduate research, primary research, undergraduate participation in research is becoming, it's just sweeping the country in the major universities. And so those undergraduates who are, the old idea that the university undergraduate library would keep 50 copies of Moby Dick, we don't need to do that anymore. I think that for undergraduates who have gone through the vetting process or having assignments, etc., that's very important that they have access to those things. I was only bringing that Bancroft issue up just as an example where there could be conflict, and that's what you have to do. You have to manage the resource.
It's a really important thing to see us as a research university that's research for undergraduates in every field you can name, and that's a rather recent development. Christina Maslach, who led off this session, had a lot to do in her service on campus to get that idea across and to build structure. The library, as Kevin said, kind of woke up to the need to welcome undergraduates into the Bancroft Library. It's literally true, you had to step over their bodies because they were waiting to get in. We couldn't possibly accommodate them, but we welcomed them. And this happened before I was here. It's not my credit, but it's the right thing to do. Some of you may not have had experience in working in other research libraries. The wonderful Huntington Library in Southern California does not admit readers who aren't at the PhD level or above. That can make you feel a little frustrated if you're 21 years old and have a research question. So that's really what we're about, is to open more of those research fields to undergraduates. And it's another reason why we seek to deploy professionals, librarians in particular, to help that happen.
Just one other aspect that's developing too is undergraduate interest in rare books and manuscript materials, and that's a growing phenomenon. It's been reported from any number of libraries, and of course that has to be fostered. And it's all part of. You might want to say the D text book, not to criticize any wonderful textbooks that anybody's written here, but this sort of movement to other alternatives in terms of primary sources in undergraduate instruction.
Yes, Jim.
We have really wonderful professional librarians on this campus, and I speak from experience in utilizing the excellent services they provide. As Margaretta said, their numbers are being depleted, they're doubling up on work, and I wondered if you could comment in terms of your historical view, which was absolutely wonderful, if I may say so. As the paradigm shifts, what will be the role of the professional librarian? Will they require new skills? Will they need to be increasingly brutalized? Will they still have the human touch? These are open questions for me personally. I would value your comments on them.
I think for university librarians, the tutorial function is going to increase. That librarians will be available as one-on-one tutors for the evolution of bibliographical searches, navigational skills of various sorts. And that was suggested this morning when they asked you ask an individual student what your major is, etc. And in fact, that's a function now today more and more that reference librarianship has become. Not just saying, well, this is a standard book, but what are you looking at? What's your topic? Have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? That's a one-on-one tutorial function. It should be kept informal because we librarians don't like to do grades. We don't like performance. We like to anchor our services in the pleasure principle and in self-discovery, self-development. But I think it's going to become a very important part of the, is becoming a very important part of the instructional mode. And another aspect is to monitor, is to work with the research faculty or undergraduates or graduate students in terms of what was said earlier, in terms of collection development. If we can't buy everything, what should we buy? And so that itself has a tutorial function. In effect, you're basically collection development is becoming a collaborative enterprise.
The only thing I might usefully add to that is that an older model of subject specialists who are experts in their field, have an academic background, that's not irrelevant, that's still important. But we're increasingly looking for people with that, who also have sort of a great desire to have a hand in reference work, in instruction, in taking material to the web and providing other tools. I think we're looking for library professionals who have a greater suite of skills than we used to. And I think that's good for us.
Also, we don't want to underestimate the influence of the great librarians of the past. You know, Panizzi and the Golden Dome, the Iron Dome rather, the British Museum. I'm delighted to think that the long line of librarians historically includes Casanova and Chairman Mao. So we take consolation.
I have to report that I was at a presentation of Peking University director, and we watched slides of the employment records of Mao Zedong, who had in fact been a staffer there. I guess not so difficult to manage, he moved on.
I was struck by Kevin's image of the deep leather chair. And it seemed to me that the whole discussion was moved very much appropriately toward the research library, the specialized library. But where is the deep leather chair? That is, most of us in academia are keenly, painfully aware of how specialized, narrow, and irrelevant most of our research has become. Where can we find this deep leather chair that will revive an interest, an imperative in general knowledge and wisdom, in the things that are found in deep leather chairs, not necessarily in specialized libraries?
I think you found it already. What a beautiful testimony to that. I think, if you read the book, I'm having a senior moment here, the Library at Midnight, the Library at Night. The whole question of the library as a premise for the intellectual life. Both the physical place, but the question that each of us must build up within herself or himself a contemplative core. And that the library, to keep the values you're talking about, and the library embodies that. I remember we heard this morning about personal libraries. The personal library, in my own history of library collection, I have a wonderful book on the personal library. And we all build a personal library within ourselves. We all have that leather chair that it's not just our subject matter, it's not just our professional things that we do, it's the books that inspired us as young people, it's the classics that we return to, it's the new challenging things we read. So librarianship is, again, a movable feast. It doesn't just belong to the research library, and the library as an institution, and Panos Papadopoulos suggested a sort of Platonic archetype. I like to think it's up there, that it represents the encounter with ideas that each of us, encounter with imaginative formation and ideas that each of us must sustain across a lifetime.
Just an illustration of how, when we move forward in technology, we don't necessarily leave behind the deep leather chair approach. One of Peter's slides showed us, I think, young people in a grain field, golden age, reading books. I believe those books did not have dust jackets on. And one of the things that the Modern Research Library decided to do is throw out dust jackets, for good reasons. But they're gone, except for special collections and other exceptions. In the past few years, publishers have enabled us to save the electronic dust jacket. So if you're interested in how people make a very short presentation of what they think they've written, if you're interested in blurbs, and I'm interested in blurbs, you can now study that in a way you couldn't, because the old-fashioned library got rid of the stuff.
Yes.
So both of you have spoken really eloquently about the continuing centrality of the research library in university life, and yet the ARL has documented over long time frames that university investment in research libraries has declined as a percentage of investment in the university research enterprise as a whole. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that and whether that's an inevitable trend because of the changing profile of the institution, or is that a problem that we need to address somehow? And if so, how do we address it?
Well, I think, you know, if I remember correctly from my high school Greek, the word scarcity, ananke, is also the Greek word for destiny. And that it's only when things are scarce that you have to make choices that you then embrace your destiny. And I think that this kind of competition is across our society. There are many competing goods. Remember what Mae West said? She said, too much of a good thing is wonderful. She also said that whenever I'm caught between two evils, I always try and select the one I've never experienced before. In other words, there's multiple voices in our society, multiple institutions, multiple competing goods. And in the case of university leadership, university fundraising, university administration, spokesperson for the university, we have to speak up and make our case, and we make our case alongside every other point of view. I used to love, as state librarian, follow the sheriffs and the prison wardens, etc., because it really got me revved up to go to the opposite extreme and saying we need more money for public libraries, etc. So I think it's a question of our faith, our political skills, our organizational and communication skills, which are very considerable on this campus.
The person who asked the question is an expert on library statistics, so I'm not going to take too much issue with her. But you have to understand how university budgets have ballooned when you look at the input of, for example, federal grants. If we look more closely at the part of the budget that was devoted to teaching and learning of undergraduates, the figures might look a little bit different. Certainly on this campus, in what we thought at the time were bad times, the university has invested well more than $100 million in better libraries in basically a 15 to 20 year period. Some of that was private money, but it is a substantial investment, and I think it shows in most, but not all, of our libraries. Keeping up with the growth of new knowledge is, of course, a different kind of challenge because it's grown so fast. And as the first panel and Bob Darton said, we made bonehead decisions about how we were going to distribute and share the scholarly research from the university. So we're paying the price.
One last point, I think if I were a mechanical engineer, I would understand how it takes more to get up from, say, 8 to 6 than it does from 100 to 85, or in other words, to say that the University of California at Berkeley Library is rated down to 24, that doesn't translate into 24 huge devolutions. It translates probably into very minuscule competitive adjustments with other great libraries. And I think that's important in terms of saying that this 24th is not a train wreck. 24th may be rather within a percentage of 2 or 3 points with the other 23. And so I don't think any great university library, provided it's doing the things that you were suggesting, should torture itself be tortured by ratings of this sort.
Could I make a comment on that?
Of course.
Just a brief comment. I really sympathize with the point that the questioners made. I think we're in serious trouble. I think that the budgets for libraries and research universities are hurting, and they're hurting very painfully. So I appreciate the silver linings, but I think we have to be realistic about it. And part of the problem, aside from politics within the university, is more books are being produced in print every year than the previous year, while the digital world is exploding around us. In 2011, there were 350,000 new titles produced in print in the United States, an increase of 6% over the previous year. Now, how many of those books can possibly be purchased? Well, there's a lot of garbage in them, I grant you, but still, the printed world is expanding at a terrific pace. And if you look at Brazil, it's doubled its book production in the last 5 years. China more than doubled its book production. We have to keep up with the knowledge that is exploding in print all around us, and yet the digital demands on our budgets are gigantic. So I agree, we have got a structural problem. How to meet it, I gather, is one of the main items on the agenda of your commission. And there are various possibilities, but I think we'd be naive if we didn't say university library budgets are just not adequate to the demands of our users and our responsibility to future generations.
Sir, I'd like to ask a question. I'd like to ask a question. Does Harvard still have total comprehensive ambitions towards its collecting in terms of its explosion that you talked about?
Well, Harvard never claimed that it bought everything. And it's not a deposit library. It's weird that we have one deposit library in this country, and there are now, I think, 9 in the UK. But there was this feeling that everything of any importance could be found in the Harvard library system. And I myself believe profoundly in it. But I get emails from faculty members all the time who say, I didn't find a book on the shelf that should have been there. So that's part of the problem. And we have the ambition, but we don't have the means, and we need to develop a policy to adjust things to what is our responsibility to the 21st century.
If I could just add a footnote there, and that is, it pertains to the stakes. When I spoke recently at the Committee on Research, one of the Senate committees that deals with research, one of the members said, well, surely you realize that research grants are given to members of this faculty with the assumption that we have a premier research library, that this isn't just a private in-house thing, but this incredibly important funding stream for our research and for our university is dependent on the substantialness of this very core resource. So anyway, I just wanted to drop that into the discussion. Carla.
Yeah, this is a follow-up on this question that I wanted to raise. The Commission's been grappling a lot with I like the word used, alignment. How to align what faculty and student needs are in collecting in this structural crisis where you have to make decisions. You can't buy everything. And both of you have a lot of experience in thinking about how to align our academic mission with the collection mission of the library. We've been thinking hard about what are the right kinds of mechanisms of consultation, because beyond sending an email when there isn't something that you want on the bookshelf. So the collection strategy and academic trends have to be aligned if you're going to navigate in an intelligent way. And how to institutionalize a more ongoing conversation between faculty and students and librarians is something we've been trying to think about quite a bit, because obviously that's the smart way to build collections in a structural crisis like the one Bob just described. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about that. How do we get that alignment right?
Well, I'll just say it's much easier for us at USC because we don't have the extraordinary research profile that UC Berkeley has. So the aligning of such an active faculty here. In our case, we have a condition of, say, over the last 30 to 35 years, we began to develop silos of research productivity in various fields, and we align ourselves with that. So it's a much easier program. But in this case, you're serving one of the planet's great universities and a very active, productive faculty. That becomes a little more sophisticated.
Yes, comprehensive excellence, which is what we stood for, is actually not such a great thing if you're a librarian and trying to figure out how to cover so many fields. Collaboration with other institutions is very important. You may be aware that we have more than 20 agreements with Stanford. I believe that's unique for Stanford. And so we collect in areas and they collect in areas. And since our faculty and graduate students can use the collections quite easily, that's a real plus, and it gives Berkeley a real boost over other UCs for a start. Larger consortial arrangements we use to mostly save money in storage, and we can save money in processing through working through those consortia. But I think the cry of alarm of how we have a comprehensive curriculum and research agenda and a library that can't be expected to keep up with that mission is really the hardest problem we're here to solve.
On that, shall we say, provocative note, it's 12:15. We need to take a break. We will pick up some of these and other topics at 1:45. See you back here then.